Long before cities were built and before money had real value, people lived in small groups deep inside forests and jungles. Life was simple, but it was also dangerous. Different tribes fought over land, food, and power. In these early times, kidnapping already existed, but it did not look the way it does today. It was not always about money. It was often about control, revenge, or survival. When one tribe attacked another, they sometimes took people instead of killing them. These captives became tools, used to send messages, create fear, or strengthen the tribe that captured them. In many jungle societies, taking someone from another group could mean gaining power. A captured person might be forced to work, serve, or even join the tribe. Sometimes they were used as a way to settle conflicts. If a tribe wanted something, like food or land, they might threaten the life of the person they had taken. This was an early form of ransom, even though money was not involved. Instead, the exchange could be goods, safety, or peace. The idea was simple. Take something valuable to force someone else to give you what you want. Fear spread quickly in these environments. When people knew that their enemies could take them or their loved ones at any time, they lived with constant tension. Parents watched their children closely. Warriors stayed alert. Nighttime became especially dangerous, as attacks often happened in the dark. The jungle itself added to the fear. Thick trees, strange sounds, and limited visibility made it easy for attackers to strike and disappear without being seen. Kidnapping became a silent weapon, one that did not need large battles to be effective. Over time, tribes became more organized. They learned from each other and improved their strategies. Kidnapping was no longer random. It became planned. Some groups would watch their enemies for days, waiting for the right moment to strike. They chose targets carefully, often picking people who were important to the tribe, like leaders or family members. This made their demands stronger and harder to refuse. Even without written rules or systems, there was already a clear understanding of how powerful kidnapping could be. As human societies slowly grew and began to move beyond the jungle, these ideas did not disappear. Instead, they traveled with people into new lands and new ways of life. The methods became smarter, and the reasons became more complex. What started as a simple act of survival and power in the jungle was beginning to change into something more calculated and dangerous. Something that would grow alongside human civilization and take on new forms as the world itself continued to evolve. As human societies grew and people began to settle in larger communities, life started to change. Villages turned into towns, and towns slowly grew into early cities. Trade began to develop, and people started to exchange goods, like food, tools, animals, and later precious items like gold and silver. With this growth came new opportunities, but also new kinds of crime. Kidnapping was no longer just about survival or tribal conflict. It began to take a new shape, one that was more organized and driven by clear goals. In these growing societies, people started to understand the value of other human beings in a different way. Important individuals, such as merchants, leaders, or family members of wealthy people, became targets. Criminal groups realized that taking these individuals could bring them rewards. Instead of trading captives for peace or safety, they now demanded valuable goods or money. This marked the beginning of ransom as we know it today. The idea became simple but powerful. Capture someone important, then demand something valuable in return for their release. As this idea spread, kidnapping became more planned and structured. It was no longer done by random individuals or small groups acting without thought. Instead, organized groups began to form. These groups worked together, each person having a role. Some would watch and gather information about the target. Others would plan the capture. Some would carry out the kidnapping, while others handled communication with the victim's family or community. This level of organization made kidnappings more successful and harder to stop. Communication also started to play a big role. In earlier times, messages were passed by word of mouth, but now written messages became more common. Kidnappers would send letters with their demands, sometimes threatening harm if their conditions were not met. These messages created fear and urgency. Families often had little choice but to follow the instructions, as they wanted their loved ones to return safely. The kidnappers used this fear to control the situation and increase their chances of getting what they wanted. At the same time, trade routes were expanding. People traveled long distances to buy and sell goods. These journeys often passed through isolated areas, far from protection. Criminal groups saw this as an opportunity. Travelers, especially wealthy ones, became easy targets. They were far from home, often carrying valuable items, and had little support if something went wrong. Kidnappers would ambush them, take them away, and then contact their families or business partners for ransom. This made trade more dangerous, and fear began to spread among merchants. Some groups even became known for their kidnapping activities. Their reputation alone was enough to create fear. People would avoid certain areas or travel with guards to protect themselves. But even with protection, kidnappers found ways to succeed. They studied their targets carefully, looking for weaknesses. They waited for the right moment, when the target was most vulnerable. This level of patience and planning made them more effective and more dangerous. In some cases, kidnapping became a regular source of income for these groups. It was no longer just a crime of opportunity. It became a system, almost like a business. They invested time and effort into making their operations better. They learned from their mistakes and improved their methods. They also created networks, working with others to share information and resources. This made it harder for authorities or communities to stop them. As societies continued to grow, early forms of law enforcement began to appear. Leaders understood that kidnapping was a serious problem. They tried to create rules and punishments to stop it. Guards were assigned to protect important people and trade routes. However, these systems were still new and often not strong enough. Criminal groups were quick to adapt. They changed their methods, avoided protected areas, and sometimes even bribed officials to look the other way. This made the fight against kidnapping even more difficult. The emotional impact of kidnapping also became clearer during this time. Families lived in fear, knowing that their loved ones could be taken at any moment. The pain of waiting for news, not knowing if the person was safe, created deep stress and suffering. Communities became more cautious, but fear still remained. Kidnappers understood this emotional pressure and used it to their advantage. The more fear they created, the more likely people were to meet their demands quickly. As time passed, the idea of organized kidnapping continued to grow and spread. What began as simple acts in small communities had now become a larger and more dangerous system. The methods were becoming smarter, the targets more valuable, and the rewards greater. This evolution was setting the stage for an even bigger change, one where kidnapping would move into crowded cities, mix with growing crime networks, and become something far more complex and difficult to control. As time moved forward, towns became larger and turned into busy cities. These cities were full of life. People walked through crowded streets, markets were always open, and businesses grew every day. There were more opportunities to make money, but there was also more crime. Criminals began to see cities as the perfect place to operate. There were many people, many hiding places, and many chances to escape without being noticed. Kidnapping changed again, becoming more complex and more dangerous than ever before. In the past, kidnapping often happened in quiet places like forests or along trade routes. But now, it started happening in crowded streets, near homes, or even during the day. Criminals learned how to blend into the environment. They dressed like normal people, watched their targets from a distance, and waited for the perfect moment. In a busy city, it was easy to disappear in a crowd. This made it harder for anyone to notice what was happening until it was too late. Gangs began to form in these cities. These were not just small groups anymore. They were larger, more organized, and more powerful. Each member had a role, just like in earlier organized groups, but now the system was more advanced. Some members followed the target for days or even weeks, learning their daily routine. Others handled transportation, using cars or hidden paths to move quickly. Some were responsible for keeping the victim hidden, while others communicated with the family to demand ransom. Everything was planned carefully, and mistakes were avoided as much as possible. Technology, even in its early forms, started to help these criminals. Communication improved, making it easier to send messages and demands. Telephones became an important tool. Kidnappers could call families directly, creating fear and pressure with their voices. They could give instructions clearly and quickly. This made the process faster and more controlled. Families had little time to think, and this increased the chances of the kidnappers getting what they wanted. Cities also had a big gap between the rich and the poor. Wealthy families lived in better areas, owned businesses, and had valuable assets. Criminals saw them as perfect targets. Taking someone from a wealthy family could bring a large ransom. Because of this, kidnappers started to focus more on high-value targets. Children of rich families, business owners, and important individuals became common victims. This made fear spread quickly among the wealthy, changing how they lived their lives. Some hired guards, avoided public places, or changed their routines often. But kidnappers did not only target the rich. In some cases, they took ordinary people too. Even if the ransom was smaller, it was still money. Some gangs focused on taking many victims instead of just one, creating a steady flow of income. This made kidnapping more common and more widespread. It was no longer rare or shocking. It became something people heard about often, something that could happen to almost anyone. The way victims were held also changed. In the past, captives were often kept in open areas or simple shelters. In cities, kidnappers used hidden locations like abandoned buildings, secret rooms, or remote houses outside the city. These places were chosen carefully to avoid attention. Victims were kept out of sight, making it difficult for authorities to find them. The longer they stayed hidden, the more pressure was put on families to pay quickly. Police forces in cities were stronger than before, but they still faced many challenges. The size of the city made it hard to control everything. There were too many people, too many places to hide, and too many criminals. Some police officers worked hard to stop kidnappings, but others were not always honest. In some cases, criminals found ways to avoid punishment, making the system weaker. This allowed kidnapping to continue growing. Fear became a part of everyday life in these cities. People started to change how they moved, where they went, and who they trusted. Parents became more protective of their children. Businesses increased security. But even with these efforts, kidnappers stayed one step ahead. They adapted quickly, changing their methods and finding new ways to succeed. Some gangs began to connect with others, forming larger networks. These networks shared information, resources, and even victims. This made them more powerful and harder to stop. What started as local gangs slowly turned into bigger criminal systems. They operated across different parts of the city, and sometimes even across regions. Their reach was growing, and so was their confidence. The emotional impact of kidnapping in cities was even stronger than before. Families lived with constant fear, not knowing if they would be the next target. Victims who returned often carried deep fear and trauma. Communities felt unsafe, and trust between people began to weaken. Kidnapping was no longer just a crime. It was a force that changed how people lived their lives. As cities continued to grow and connect with each other, these criminal networks also expanded. They became smarter, more organized, and more powerful. The simple acts of kidnapping from the past had now turned into a complex system, driven by money, planning, and control. And as this system grew, it was slowly moving towards something even bigger and more dangerous, where powerful cartels would take control and turn kidnapping into a global business. As time went on, small gangs and city networks began to grow into something much bigger. These groups became powerful criminal organizations known as cartels. Unlike the gangs before them, cartels were highly organized and operated like real businesses. They had leaders, systems, rules, and strong control over their members. Kidnapping was no longer just one of many crimes they did. It became one of their main sources of income. It was planned carefully, executed with precision, and treated like a serious operation. Cartels did not act randomly. They chose their targets with great care. They studied people who had money, influence, or connections. Before taking someone, they gathered as much information as possible. They learned about daily routines, security systems, and family members. This planning could take days or even weeks. By the time they acted, they already knew almost everything about the victim. This made their operations very effective and difficult to stop. When a kidnapping happened, it was fast and controlled. Cartel members worked as a team. Some blocked the area, some grabbed the victim, and others made sure no one could interfere. Within minutes, the person would be gone, taken to a hidden location. These places were often far from the city or well hidden inside it. They could be empty houses, secret rooms, or even underground spaces. The goal was to keep the victim out of sight and under control at all times. Once the victim was secured, the cartel moved to the next step: communication. They contacted the family with clear and strict instructions. The message was simple: pay the ransom or face serious consequences. They often used fear to make sure the family acted quickly. Every word, every message, and every demand was planned to create pressure. The faster the family paid, the faster the cartel could move on to the next operation. For cartels, kidnapping became a business model. They calculated risks and rewards. They knew how much money to demand and how far they could push without losing control of the situation. Some even had systems to manage multiple kidnappings at once. Different teams handled different tasks, making the process smooth and organized. It was no longer just crime. It was an operation built on structure and discipline. The impact on victims and families was very deep. Families lived in fear, not knowing what would happen next. They followed instructions carefully, hoping to see their loved ones again. Victims, on the other hand, faced long periods of fear and uncertainty. Even after being released, many struggled to return to normal life. The experience stayed with them, affecting their thoughts and emotions for a long time. At the same time, cartels became more powerful. Their success in kidnapping brought them more money, and with money came influence. They expanded their operations, reaching new areas and forming stronger networks. This made it even harder for authorities to stop them. The fight against kidnapping was becoming more complex as these groups continued to grow and adapt in ways that were difficult to predict. As kidnapping grew into a powerful and organized crime, governments around the world began to take it more seriously. Police forces were no longer dealing with small groups or simple cases. They were now facing strong criminal networks that were smart, careful, and well prepared. To fight this, special units were created. These units focused only on kidnapping cases. They were trained to handle dangerous situations, track criminals, and rescue victims safely. Their work was difficult, but it was necessary. Law enforcement started using better methods to stop kidnappers. They collected information, studied patterns, and followed leads carefully. When a kidnapping happened, they worked quickly to understand who was involved and where the victim might be held. Time was very important. The longer a victim stayed in captivity, the harder it became to find them. Police teams used surveillance, phone tracking, and informants to gather clues. Every small detail could help solve the case. Negotiation also became a key part of their work. In many cases, families were already in contact with the kidnappers. Police had to guide them on what to say and how to act. The goal was to keep the victims safe while also trying to catch the criminals. This was not easy. One wrong move could put the victim in danger. Officers had to stay calm, think clearly, and make careful decisions under pressure. There were times when operations were successful. Victims were rescued, and kidnappers were arrested. These victories gave hope to communities and showed that crime could be fought. Families were reunited, and justice was served. But not every case ended this way. Some kidnappers were able to escape. Others managed to collect ransom and disappear without leaving clear evidence. These failures were painful and reminded everyone how strong and prepared these criminal groups had become. One of the biggest challenges for law enforcement was corruption. In some places, not all officials could be trusted. Criminals sometimes found ways to bribe their way out of trouble or get information about police plans. This made it harder to stop them. Even when officers worked hard and risked their lives, these hidden problems weakened their efforts. It created a situation where the fight against kidnapping was not just about catching criminals, but also about fixing the system itself. Communities also played an important role. People were encouraged to report suspicious activities and stay alert. Awareness campaigns were created to teach families how to protect themselves. Simple actions like changing routines, improving security, and staying cautious helped reduce risk. Still, fear remained. Many people felt that kidnappers were always one step ahead. The battle between law enforcement and kidnappers became a constant struggle. Each side learned from the other. When police improved their methods, criminals adapted. When criminals changed their tactics, police worked to catch up. It was like a never-ending game, where both sides were always trying to outsmart each other. As this fight continued, it became clear that the future of kidnapping would not only depend on criminals, but also on how well societies could respond to this growing threat. Today, kidnapping still exists in many parts of the world, but it has changed again with modern life. Technology has made communication faster, and this has affected how kidnappers operate. In the past, they used letters or phone calls. Now, they can use mobile phones, messaging apps, and even the internet to contact families. This makes their demands quicker and sometimes harder to trace. They can hide their identity, change locations fast, and create fear without being seen. The crime has become more digital, but the fear it causes is still very real. Modern kidnappers also use new ways to choose their targets. They can gather information from social media, public records, or online activity. People often share their daily lives on the internet without thinking about the risks. This gives criminals an opportunity to study them without being noticed. They can learn where someone lives, where they go, and who they are close to. This makes planning easier and more accurate. What used to take weeks of watching can now be done in a much shorter time. At the same time, governments and law enforcement have also improved their tools. They use advanced technology to track calls, monitor online activity, and follow digital trails. Cameras in cities, data systems, and faster communication between agencies have made it easier to respond to crimes. In some cases, this has helped stop kidnappings before they happen. It has also helped rescue victims more quickly. However, criminals continue to adapt. When one method is blocked, they find another way. This keeps the challenge alive. In many places, people are becoming more aware of the risks. Families take more precautions, such as limiting what they share online and being careful about their routines. Schools, businesses, and communities also teach safety and awareness. These steps help reduce the chances of becoming a target. But even with all these efforts, kidnapping has not disappeared. It remains a serious problem, especially in areas where crime networks are strong. The emotional impact of kidnapping is still one of its most powerful effects. Families go through fear, stress, and uncertainty. Victims who return often need time to heal, both mentally and emotionally. The experience can change how they see the world. It can affect trust, confidence, and daily life. This shows that kidnapping is not just about money, it is about the deep effect it has on people. Looking back, it is clear how much kidnapping has changed. It started in small jungle tribes as a way to gain power or survive. As the world continues to grow and change, the future of kidnapping will also change. New technology will bring new risks, but it will also bring new ways to fight crime. The outcome will depend on how people, communities, and governments respond. The story of kidnapping is still being written, shaped by both those who commit the crime and those who work to stop it. And what comes next may be even more complex than anything seen before.